Hi everyone, Ainsley here from Small Fry Creations, where we tackle everything DIY, and this week I'm building a dining table. Let me show you how I did it. You've seen it. Today we are going to build a dining table, and although this may be one of my biggest builds, I actually think it's one of the more simpler ones, because let's be honest, what we're really doing is just creating a really big wooden panel. Our first step is we need to mill up the timber. I am using black butt for this project. I am going to create a jig so that I can joint each of the sticks on the table saw. So let's first off build the jig for that and then get to milling. I think the key to this project is preparation, and it all starts with this jig to joint the timber. This will ensure I have the best chance of a stress-free glue up. The timber is fairly straight, and if I was dealing with shorter lengths, I probably wouldn't have worried about the jig, but dealing with timber that is 1800 long called for the jig and the timber to be jointed. Alright, the jig I'm going to use on the table saw to joint one side of these boards is all complete. Like in all things woodworking, I've kind of had to think on my feet and problem solve as I go. I did have one idea, but that was not holding the timber and not working. So I've got these toggle clamps, but they're little. I would have rather used big ones, but we're in lockdown. I'm not waiting for an order to come in and I'm not going out. So I've used some blocks of MDF here to build up the back of the jig so that the small toggle clamps can work. This piece of timber is not going anywhere. Now, how the jig works, I have got the piece of timber overhanging ever so slightly at the bottom of the jig here, and then I will run this side of the jig up against the table saw fence, which will give me one straight edge, and then I can run that edge against the table saw fence, giving me two parallel edges. So I've got 12 sticks of timber that it's got to run through the table saw and get all squared up. So let's keep moving and get to work. I worked my way through the pieces of timber to get one straight side. I just needed to make sure that the timber was hanging over the jig slightly all the way along the jig so that the saw blade could create a straight edge. Once I got through all 12 pieces of timber, I could adjust the table saw to 80 mil and run the timber through with the fresh cut side against the fence. It was then time to think about gluing up. We're up to the part where we're going to glue the tabletop up, and to keep the stress levels low, I'm going to glue it up in sections and glue 3 pieces of timber together at a time. The other advantage of doing it this way means that I can put it through the thicknesser, get everything flat before I glue it up into one big tabletop. To help with the alignment in the glue up, I'm going to use biscuits, and I was super excited to use my new Makita trim router, which if you haven't checked out the video before this one, you certainly should, where I put the router through its paces and show you some great ways that you can be using the router in the workshop today. However, if you are building a project that is literally bigger than you, sometimes it calls for bigger tools, and this one is no different. I am going to use the big Triton because the little Makita just doesn't have the plunge depth that is required, because I can really only get the biscuit cutter 6 mil below the surface. This guy will allow me to get the biscuit cutter into the center of the timber. So let's go ahead and get some biscuits cut, and then we can get to glue up. Now, I like to be honest with you, so here's the truth. With the biscuit cutter I was using, the bigger Triton router didn't mean that I could get to the middle of the boards like I first thought. When I was testing, the router was off, so the Triton plunged all the way down, which is for changing router bits. But when the router is in operation, for safety, you can't plunge all the way down. Also, the collet hit the wood, so I couldn't go down as far as I wanted. I could, however, get 10 mil down, which was better than the smaller router. The main reason I was worried is I wanted the biscuits to be as close to the middle so that there was no risk of the biscuits becoming exposed when I was putting the boards through the thicknesser. The biscuits worked great and really helped keep everything aligned and stop the pieces moving around in the glue up. This biscuit cutter may be my new favourite tool in the workshop. It was the hero of this project for sure. Now, when it comes to glue ups, I can't recommend this piece of advice more. Preparation is key. Having all clamps within arm's reach before starting and having a plan of which clamps will go where will mean that the stress levels remain low and you can systematically work through the glue up. The first clamps I like to put on are the ones on the ends. This will bring the ends of the timber into alignment top to bottom. I can then start to tighten down the clamps. I apply clamps to the top and the bottom, as this will help stop any bowing in the timber. I also use cauls, which in my case are pieces of plywood covered in sticky tape to stop the glue from sticking to them, and I clamp them across the boards. This brings all the boards into alignment with each other. As I was using just about every clamp I owned, I would clamp one set of boards together, wait 2 hours, and then repeat the process. I kept the boards under the width the thicknesser could take, as I wanted to be able to run them through the thicknesser so that I had less glue joints to worry about at the sanding stage. With the boards glued up, I could run the boards through the thicknesser to clean them up. Taking all the time to prepare in the glue up and getting things level as possible meant I only really need to remove a couple of mil from the boards. I'm using Titebond 3 as it works well with Aussie hardwoods and is also water resistant. And it's now time to glue these 4 sections into one large tabletop. Again, using biscuits to help with the alignment was so helpful. I am telling you, if you have a router and don't have a biscuit cutter bit in your arsenal, you're missing out. The glue up was fairly stress-free and we just systematically worked through the clamps. Having the engineer as an extra pair of hands and eyes was really helpful to make sure nothing was missed and the clamps were on as quick as possible. While that dried, I could work on the template for shaping the table. We're going to start shaping the dining table, and one end of the dining table has a semicircle, so that's what we're going to work on first. I've got myself a piece of plywood here which is the same width as the dining table, and I have got the trim router in the circle cutting jig that I have just made. If you want to know how to make this jig, head over to my last video where I show you some really easy and great ways to be using the trim router in the workshop. I've got everything marked out, so I just need to get it nailed into place, cut out the semicircle, then we can head over to the dining table and start shaping. Creating the template was fairly straightforward, but having the SketchUp model to refer to did help. I nailed my jig to the plywood and using a straight bit, I cut out a semicircle. With the table out of clamps, I could place the template in place and start to set up for the cut. This is where things started to get challenging and plans had to keep changing. Hey. Sometimes in woodworking you go in with a plan and as things unfold, you've got to change things up and pivot, and that is happening on this project. My original plan was to use this template and my flush trim bit to shape the table and cut away the majority of the waste with the jigsaw, but the jigsaw is creating crazy deflection in the timber just because the timber is so thick and so hard. So I've got to change things up. I also can't use this flush trim bit because, again, this is not long enough and it's got the both bearings. You're meant to be able to remove that top one, but I am just not strong enough. I cannot get it undone. So that's the other reason why I've got to change it up. So I'm going to use the marking hole on the template because that is still helpful. I am going to then use the trim router to get as deep as I can, and then I will come back through with the big Triton router and the big flush trim bit and flush up the table and shape everything. So that is now the new plan. Let's keep moving, see if it works. Now, technically, because I had to change the plans, the template wasn't needed. But in saying that, I am glad I had the template. It meant I had practice cutting the shape and I had the holes marked for the router and I knew it was going to be right. With the hole for the router transferred from the template, I could use the trim router and a straight bit to cut as deep as I could. I took my time and did the cut in a number of passes. All right, here goes nothing. I've got the flush trim router bit in the big Triton. It's ready to go. It looks good from the top, but I've now just got to finish it off. This is probably the most nerve-wracking, or one of the most nerve-wracking things I have had to do in woodworking because I really don't want to mess up the table. So let's get in and have a go. If I'm doing a happy dance at the end of this, you know it worked. At this point, the happy dance was on hold. The router bit just didn't work, and this was not a good option. I will get into that in a second, but I had to rethink my solution. I switched to the Triton router and a half-shank straight bit and cut away most of the table. I made sure I was cutting clear of the line that I'd cut with the trim router and cut as deep as I could with the straight bit. I then turned the table over and transferred the mounting holes to the top side of the table and completed the cut, cutting away most of the waste. I think we're up to like version 3 of the plan, but we're getting there and I'm learning a ton along the way. So that's the main thing. This quarter shank templating bit is not going to cut the mustard. It's chipping its paint. it's having trouble cutting through, it's jumping all over the place. So I've had to get rid of that one and upgrade to the big gun. So I've now got a half shank templating bit in the big Triton router, which should do the job. I also used a half shank straight bit to cut away the majority of the table, and then this guy won't have to work as hard and he can clean it up, running that bearing along that section of timber that we cut out with the trim router, which we know is the exact and perfect size. So hopefully in a couple of minutes we'll have, or on our way to having, a nicely shaped dining table. Finally, I had a solution that was working. The large half shank router bit was working perfectly and handling the hardwood like a pro. Like I said when I was cutting the biscuits, I should have known that working on a project bigger than me, I need to reach for the bigger tools. Anyway, I made my way around the table and it was finally ready for that happy dance to commence. Right, with the 10-minute happy dance over, I could turn my attention to trimming the other end square. I used my new track saw to cut the table to length and square. When it comes to edge profiles for the table, I went with a large chamfer on the underside and a small roundover on the top side. The table is going to be in an apartment and I don't want to command all of the space, so by having a heavy chamfer on the bottom, it lightens the table a little and I think creates a really nice edge profile. Ah, the sanding. It always takes a lifetime, but I was thankful for the thicknesser as it did most of the heavy lifting. I started at 80 grit and worked my way up to 240 grit. I had a couple of small cracks along the glue joints, and to fix them I picked up this really neat trick recently and it worked really well. I applied wood glue that dries clear to the crack and then sanded over it with no dust collection on the sander. It fills the cracks seamlessly and you will never know. Once I got to 240 grit, I cleaned the table down with water. This removes dust and pops the grain. Once dry, I sanded again with 240 grit and started to think about mounting the legs on the table. The table legs were purchased online at Matt Blatt and I'll leave links below for them. I took the time to get the legs into position, taking into consideration where the chairs were going to go so that no one was going to be sitting at the table with a table leg between their legs. The legs have pre-drilled mounting holes, so once in position, I transferred the holes to the table. We're on the home stretch and up to the point where I'm going to attach the legs, and to do that, I'm going to use threaded inserts. I think these are a more professional look, and also over time, if the client needs to move the table, they can easily take the legs on or off without damaging the table. These will hold up better over time. Now to install these, I'm going to use 3 different drill bits. I'm going to use a Forster bit to start with that is slightly wider than the head of the threaded insert, and that's just to go below the surface so that this guy will sit flush. I'm then going to get the hole started with a spade bit that is 12 mil. I like that it's got a really nice point. It is helpful to get the hole started, but I can't use this the entire way because the table is about 42 mil in thickness and I need to drill to around about 32, 35 mil, and I don't want the point of the spade bit going through the table. So once I've got the hole started, I will then use a 12 mil regular drill bit to drill the full depth that I need. I'm going to use 35 mil black bolts because then they'll be hidden nicely with the black legs. I've got 12 of them to install, so let's go ahead, get them installed, then I can check that everything is working as I expect it to, and then take the legs back off and apply finish to the table. Threaded inserts worked really well, and after installing the first couple, I had a really good system down pat and the install got quicker. When screwing the inserts into place, I added a little super glue to the inserts just to help them really set in the holes. Before moving to the second leg, I checked that I had done everything right on the first leg. The holes lined up and worked, but there is very little play with the legs, so the holes have to be spot on. My advice would be to drill out the holes on the legs a little and use washers with the screws so you have some play in the event that the holes are slightly off. With the first leg complete, it was rinse and repeat on the second. The legs are super sturdy and solid. Before moving to finish, I had to deal with a small bark hole on the top side of the table. I mixed up some 5-minute clear epoxy and used this to fill the hole. This worked really well and was quick, so I could come back shortly after and sand everything smooth. Now it's time to apply finish. There are so many finishes out there with a million opinions on which you should use. I decided to go with my trusty finish, which is CFP Floor Finish in Satin. I like this because it's affordable and it doesn't change the colour of the timber, it's hard wearing and it doesn't get sticky if it's in direct sunlight like some other finishes I've used in the past. I applied 2 coats to the bottom and 4 coats to the top, sanding with 600 grit in between coats. The table was then finished and ready for delivery. This table I think is a fantastic option for apartments or open plan living, as the semicircle on the end creates a nice flowing look from one room to the next. You can comfortably seat 5 or 6 people around the table, and it's something a little bit different from the traditional dining room table shapes. There you have it, the dining table is all complete and installed. I'm super proud and happy of how this project has turned out. If you have liked this project, help me out by hitting those subscribe and like buttons, and I'll see you on the next one.